The AI trial pitting Elon Musk versus Sam Altman has recently ended in the favor of the latter. Elon famously predicted that Altman and his co-founder Greg Brockman would become two of the most hated people. To me, it seems that all of the billionaires in this trial come off as opportunistic and self-serving. Perhaps worst of all, they seem to be craving control of this key technology and through it of the population, the economy, and politics. AI has already experienced serious pushback from employees fired, errors from the hallucinating AI, some of them very costly, to data centers introducing noise pollution and driving up energy costs. Now, in this crazy drive for AI and the FOMO that's around it, it's easy to forget that not only is there a lack of investment and a return on investment, but there are fundamental problems that were seen from the outset that are now coming to pass. In this video, I'm going to tell you the story of how and why Google initially rejected AI when it was discovered at Google Brain and draw connections with today's hype. I'm Dr. Max Nervlansky. Welcome to Biocomputational with Max. Let me start by discussing the expenditures on this technology, which are very extensive and are in fact a major driving force of the US economy. If it was not for capital expenditure, CapEx on AI, US economy would not be posting growth. Perhaps it would be even in the negative. Now, this year, AI CapEx is projected to exceed 800 billion and will be approaching or exceeding $1 trillion next year if all goes well. I don't expect they will have that kind of money next year. There have been massive layoffs at companies like Oracle and Block that have been linked directly to AI. As I've mentioned, this is not creating any fans because technology is not only displacing people, but it's clearly immature and oftentimes actually more expensive than people. Of course, there is lack of broad profitability, and it may never be positive with that kind of breadth of technology that some massive companies are betting on, like Oracle, Meta, Microsoft, and XAI. There is this tremendous disbalance of spending and profitability, especially compared with some competitors like DeepSeek, which may be much more cost effective. In fact, it seems to me that with the massive tokenization of all kinds of functions, cost effectiveness as well as quality will be very important. In fact, it may become the dominant feature as the technology matures and becomes commoditized. But coming back to the lure of technological dominance, it is so strong and the FOMO is so strong that many major companies appear to be betting the house on this technology. Here, I'm going to make an analogy that this technology has had attraction and the effect of ant poison for big tech. Let me go through the detail of how it came to be. The transformer or large language model technology really has no intelligence behind the wheel. It has the appearance of intelligence, which is a wonderful emergent property from massive synthesis of building blocks, which are tokens, words that are glued together based on essentially frequency of the training set. It's a probabilistic function that goes with essentially the most likely next word, literally. So essentially, you could call it a kind of an autocorrect function on steroids, but obviously it has limitations. It's interesting, actually, that some people some creators have thought as early as 2022 that they have achieved AGI because the models they created were able to fool the creators. Now, this probabilistic model, as I mentioned, is outputting one token after another, and it will create strings of these that are that even the creators are apparently unable to recognize from being artificial, which of course is passing the Turing test. But really, this is not intelligence, however artificial. This is natural language processing, which is a very useful function. This development in late 2017, Google saw that there were significant problems with this technology, which I'll describe a little bit more in detail later, but effectively rejected it at the time. And it was only the appearance of ChatGPT and FOMO that essentially brought them back into the rat race. Now, there are many ironic aspects about the lack of a return on investment. There was, for example, an MIT study of some 300 projects showing that only 5 were providing any return on investment. Coding with Claude tested under realistic conditions showed that it actually slowed down delivery of the final product. They did additional testing, but they saw that although by some metrics more code was being produced, it was definitely of lower quality. So essentially, at the end of the day, it's really not accelerating product development and coding, which is one of the key applications. So the massive capex is hard to justify, and it's literally bankrupting companies like OpenAI and Oracle. OpenAI, of course, promised hundreds of billions of revenue to services to and purchases, respectively, of Microsoft, Azure, and NVIDIA GPUs. If OpenAI fails to deliver the whole ecosystem from the hardware down to software levels, we'll be in trouble. Let me make another analogy with this technology. It's a massive investment in a horse and buggy technology, in the sense that it is immature. Of course, a closer analogy may be railroads, but a horse and buggy is more dramatic. Investing, well, let's say trillions, using modern numbers, in that kind of technology, because it seems to be the future of transportation. If everybody previously was walking, may seem funny on one hand, but on the other hand, it certainly sounds like the sales pitch of what we have now. Something that's faster in some respects, but it's certainly not very cost efficient. And there's a question about maturity. This technology evolves rapidly in terms of GPUs, for example, amortizing, becoming less valuable. And there's a big question about that with, for example, Michael Murray of Big Short, who has challenged the industry's amortization practice of essentially 5 to 6 years is impractically long. In fact, if we look back at the time when GPT-2 came out, it was running off of the newest H100 chips, and they're now essentially 4 generations old. 3 newer generations are around, so 4 generations including H100. The newer chips include H200, B200, and GB200. So Yuan Jensen himself has famously said, or perhaps infamously, who will buy the chips of today? You wouldn't be able to give them away several years from now. There is a massive overinvestment in certain technology, as occurred, for example, in the case of UK with railroads. It was a useful technology, but overinvestment essentially ensured that it was significantly downhill financially. This analogy of immature technologies can be related to the first one, which I think is really key to wrap one's mind around what's happening. It's a big draw with a slow poison. Now, the CEOs are drawn to this like moths to a flame. That's why I think this analogy is apt. And I'm not trying to denigrate AI. I use it in various ways, and it certainly has saved me time and money, but it has been certainly grossly misrepresented. And for companies, it acts as ant poison, including those that are trying to adopt it, many of whom are not seeing return on investment and are firing people needlessly, as well as those who are trying to develop it. For example, Meta famously has fired thousands of people, in part to free money for capex into hardware. Certainly not inspiring any kind of loyalty in the remaining employees. The ant poison is very simple. It's essentially a sugary water with a slow-acting poison based on boron, as it happens. This poison is sufficiently slow-acting that the ants are able to bring the sugary drink back to the nest to poison the entire colony. And that's where I think this analogy is apt. This idea has spread around and it's very attractive on the surface, but the price is longer term and it's not paid. There is a lot of other analogies one can draw, perhaps with plasticizers and plastic making companies. They've made a lot of money, but the toxicity is long term and they're not responsible for it. But let me briefly come back to the efficiency of these so-called agents. As at least 55% of the companies who have fired their employees in favor of them are regretting these decisions. With big tech betting the house on AI, there's a lot of risk to not just their well-being, but to survival of some. And they're moving forward despite evidence of downsides on corporate performance, and CapEx is unabated despite the fact that return on investment is not yet there, except perhaps for NVIDIA. And OpenAI is able to move the laundry machine for now, but capital is running out. As I was saying, the reason why initially Google rejected it is that they saw the long-term impact, but now the short-term benefits are unavoidably attractive and there's FOMO. In fact, I posed this very question to Google AI, so I think it's interesting to kind of go over this. This is literally the question that I posed to Gemini. Why this technology that was described in the paper Attention All You Need by several Google scientists, including Noam Shazir, initially rejected by AI. Let me make a brief aside why this kind of drew my attention at the time. Noam Shazir was a schoolmate of mine when my family brought me out of Russia to United States. They came to an area of Massachusetts near Boston with a very good public high school, and I lived on the same street, a few houses down the street, in fact, on Rock Avenue from Noam. It was interesting to see his name in the context of a essentially teenager suicide and wrongful death lawsuit, so I kind of investigated it. Coming back to the story, at the time, Google, as I mentioned, saw this publication but failed to take full advantage, and two co-authors, Noam, out of 7 co-authors, Noam Shazir and Daniel De Freitas, started this company called Character AI with funding from famous VC firm Andreessen Horowitz's A16Z. Now, after ChatGPT came out and OpenAI essentially became popular, Google bought Character AI back for a cool 2.7 billion rupee. So why did Google not recognize the potential in 2017 and have to pay so much to get back their computer scientists? And this is what Gemini AI answered to me. There were 3 main points: that there was innovator's dilemma and search cannibalization. I will explain that there was reputation risk and so-called halting problem. And finally, there was a cultural impact. Let me go through these quickly. The first point is very relevant with the search engine capitalization being the key cash cow of Google. Let's be frank about it. And large language models are an alternative to that with completely different economics. This is why all of the current models are really unsustainable, because it is a very capable system, but a very expensive one. And a lot of these AI providers, LLM providers, are going to pricing per token, especially for enterprise business. So Google at the time recognized the threat that LLMs would pose to its traditional Google search. And there would be no reason for a user to go through the links. And furthermore, as I mentioned, those web scrollers are very low cost and therefore high margin, whereas AI is very high in compute, both in terms of hardware and electricity even to run it. These are gigawatt data centers for a reason. Google also saw the problem of to their reputation, and this is the so-called halting problem. They saw that they would face a lot of scrutiny if there were problems with this model. So they did have an internal research model called Lambda, a language model for dialogue application, and it was prone to hallucinations and biased outfits. And so they reasonably were concerned about what users would do with essentially errors. There were, in fact, some PR problems. As I mentioned, in 2022, one of their researchers, Blake Lemon, claimed that Lambda was sentient. And that created a PR nightmare. And so Google had to prioritize responsible AI framework, which was ethical, but it slowed down the transition to the consumer product. And they were outpaced by OpenAI and ultimately decided to just spend lavishly to buy their people back with their character AI hardware, but also importantly with liabilities, including at least one, well, actually more wrongful deaths associated with it. One of them, the very perhaps famous one, was a suicide of a teenager who was essentially addicted, and his parents tried to do everything they could to prevent contact with AI, which encouraged him to unalive himself. It was tragic, but there's something to say about that as well, how the company handled it specifically. So the third reason why Gemini AI said that Google rejected adopting the technology back in 2017, where they had it in-house with a clear lead, was the cultural shift. Google Brain and DeepMind were essentially academic research environments. They would provide publications, kind of like academics do, state-of-the-art papers, what they called soda papers. And attention is all you need is one of those, and that was sufficient for them. They prioritized it instead of shipping aggressively this error-prone software with all kind of liability. Of course, that resulted in brain drain. Scientists like Noam and Daniel saw that their work would be slow to be adopted, and they reasonably wanted to see it in the hands of millions and to profit. And so when Google hesitated to release this conversational interface to the public, they basically started character AI. There was a pretty impressive payout to get that kind of talent back, as well as a bit of code. But also they got, as I mentioned, the liability. Why this price was justified? Google said that talent scarcity was key. And these, of course, were well-established performers in the field. And I certainly know him to be a very bright individual. There was the desire to accelerate Gemini, and Google, in fact, declared a code red, similar to how OpenAI likes to declare code red with Sam Altman. And of course, they were able to get software and IP by buying back these founders. So this is the paper, to recap, that introduced transformer technology, which Google was slow to adapt and OpenAI basically bypassed them on. And its focus was parallelization and self-attention, but it is an inherently probabilistic model, as you can see here. Now, let me briefly go over the cost that they were willing to incur, I mean Google, in order to buy back this company. Character AI faced liability before, and it was settled in January 2026 for several wrongful deaths regarding child safety, but they continue to face legal liability. For example, the state of Pennsylvania is alleging that chatbots of Google's making have posed as licensed doctors offering medical advice. And there are other pending lawsuits, including another wrongful death with yet another suicide by a young man, again, inspired by Google's Gemini. This is a story very similar to Character AI, which essentially lured a very young and impressionable young person with the allure of speaking with Daenerys from the Game of Thrones. And this is what AI is good at. It's good at imitating humans. Of course, that means a lot of its kind of key applications fall, I'm sorry to say, in the fraud category. There are plenty useful ones, but this inability to distinguish human from artificial is key for fraud. And of course, there are these eventualities with impressionable people, some of whom who may be young and impressionable, others who may be just, impressionable older people, perhaps in need of professional psychiatric assistance, but they're getting led by some chatbot that has no concept of responsibility. So as I mentioned, Google had to settle several wrongful death lawsuits brought by at least two families involving mental health crises and at least one suicide of teenagers. I have a bit of an indecent question. Did they pay anything comparable to settle these wrongful death lawsuits to the families of the deceased of these children as they did to the founders of Character AI? Again, it's a very interesting technology, and I think it's great that innovators like Google are able to, make great amounts of money. But knowing some things about individuals like Noam, because I've had the privilege of uh, having been in a number of privileged, let's put it that way, institutions myself, with extremely smart people. So I know that, especially among mathematicians, there can be this interesting capability of disconnecting certain practical matters which allow the mathematician to distill the essence. But this reductionist approach can be simplistic. So there is a certain idiot savant kind of quality to all great mathematicians. And I don't think they really thought things through carefully. So I think there's certainly, moral liability about that. And I kind of wonder a little bit how that type of knowledge affects them. But the point here is that Google was willing to buy back that liability for good amounts of money. I don't think they paid nearly that much to the family members. So it kind of shows, again, their own moral compass. Google started with a motto of don't be evil. Now they're into making money and paying money for talent. But it's okay, I guess, to move quickly and break things. That's a bit of a motto of big tech. So there was another suicide in October 2025, as I mentioned, that is now being attributed to Google's Gemini, and fathers is suing Google, claiming Gemini chatbot drove his fatal delusion. I think, aside from image generation, which is a very cool function with, again, also some problematic capabilities, AI is a wonderful tool, but it really should be called natural language processing. Of course, if they called it NLP as opposed to AI, they probably wouldn't be able to raise tens or even hundreds of billions for this. So how do we view this crazy investment despite returns and the risks? I think the attraction is control. This is the nature of the mad race to essentially enslave the rest of humanity. It is a brave new world kind of technology, and it's deeply unattractive. So they think that they will be able to control us through the algorithm, which is how Yanis Varoufakis has described techno-feudalism coming about. The belief is that there is centralized control of the algorithm, and all the people will pay rent to you. We will owe nothing. And that's, of course, the problem of centralized control. Of course, even idealized AI use, which is far beyond its capability and especially its reliability, would involve other problems besides this type of control, including taking many jobs. So, as I said, deeply unattractive kind of approach, and they're pushing it without financial returns. So again, I think it's being driven by this desire to control us, appropriately referred in Karen Howe's book about OpenAI, entitled Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's OpenAI. To summarize, it seems that Google was thinking more clearly in 2017 when it was very cautious about the transformer technology, calling it AI and giving it to the public with all of the inherent liabilities and detriments to its core model. Now it's drawing down the balance sheets of all the major big tech companies, and those companies that have made serious investments in it and adopting AI technology have yet to see a return. Of course, much of it is on them with the ability to pick the right projects, but it's also the technology. So I would love to hear about what you think on this topic, and whether Google should have moved earlier or whether it should be more cautious now because these liabilities continue to accrue. Please like, join, and share.